The wind came down off the Mogollon Rim that winter like something the heavens had sent to scrape Arizona territory clean of every living thing. She was standing on Ezra Holt's porch when he finally opened the door. Frost welded into her shawl, moccasins soaked black at the seams, her dress split at the collar and torn along the thigh. Rope had worn her wrists raw, not old scars, days new. Inside, in a drawer 3 winters unopened, sat a ring he could neither touch nor bury, the last thing left to him since the fever took his wife and daughter up to the 2 markers on the ridge. But she hadn't stumbled onto his cabin by luck. Someone had sent her, and whoever held the other end of that rope was already riding. Have you ever had to open a door you knew might bring trouble just because it was the right thing to do? The wind came down off the Mogollon Rim like something with teeth, and Ezra Holt felt it try the seams of his cabin the way a man tries a lock he doesn't have permission to open. Arizona territory in the dead of winter didn't ask what a man wanted. It only asked what he could survive. He shoved the door shut with his shoulder, the wood swollen tight in its frame, and dropped the iron latch into place with the same flat motion he used for everything now. No wasted movement, no wasted feeling. 2 split logs went into the stove. The flames caught slow, orange licking up through the bark. And for a moment the only sound in the cabin was the fire finding its breath. He didn't light the lamp. Hadn't in longer than he could account for. Darkness suited him better than the alternative, because the alternative meant looking at the things the shadows hid. The second chair nobody sat in anymore, the worn patch on the shelf where a cradle used to rock, the drawer 3 winters unopened because inside it was a ring he couldn't bring himself to touch and couldn't bring himself to bury. He sat at the table with his forearms flat against the scarred wood and let the quiet over him the way it did every night. Out here, quiet wasn't peace. It was just the one thing that never left. The knock came so soft he almost mistook it for the stove settling. Then it came again, a scrape, then something closer to bone against timber. And every year he'd spent scouting for the army rose up in him at once. Cabins this far into the ravine didn't get visitors, not unless the visitor was carrying trouble or dying of it. He rose slow, his knees stiff from a day spent mending fence in frozen ground, and lifted the Winchester from where it leaned against the wall. He didn't raise it, just carried it crossed over his forearm the way a man carries a warning he hopes he won't have to use, and crossed to the door and opened it only as far as the dark outside required. The wind shoved a fistful of ice through the gap before he even saw her. She stood on the porch boards like something the storm had tried to erase and hadn't quite managed. Small against the black of the ravine, but upright. The kind of upright that comes not from strength but from refusing to be the one who falls first. Frost had stiffened the shawl to her shoulders. Her hair hung tangled and wind whipped across a face gone pale with cold, and her moccasins had soaked through hours ago, dark and ruined at the seams. The dress underneath was torn at the collar and split along one thigh, the fabric frozen stiff where it clung to her skin. Her wrists where the shawl slipped showed rope marks gone raw and dark against her skin. Not old scars, but new ones, days new. She didn't ask if he was the man of the place. She only looked at him, eyes steady despite everything else about her giving out. And when she spoke, her voice came low and cracked from cold and exhaustion both. "Please, barely more than breath. Don't leave me out here." Ezra didn't answer. He held the door and watched her a long moment. The fringe of her torn dress snapping in the wind, the exposed skin at her collarbone, gone the color of old snow. Her arms trembled under the shawl, but her spine held like she'd break clean through before she'd kneel and ask twice. When she spoke again, her voice scraped rougher, and there was something in it that sounded rehearsed, like a bargain she'd already made peace with offering. "I'll keep your bed warm," she said, "every night. Just not out here. Not tonight." Something in Ezra's chest went hard and flat at that, colder than the wind at his back. "I didn't ask for that," he said, voice low, final. "Won't be starting now." But he didn't shut the door either. He stepped back instead and pulled it wide enough for her to pass, because whatever she'd offered and whatever he'd refused, the fact standing in front of him was still a woman about to die of the cold if he did nothing. She hesitated on the threshold, one breath longer than he expected. Like the offer of shelter without a price attached to it was a language she didn't trust herself to translate correctly. Then she crossed it, stumbling once that had carried her further than they should have. He shut the door behind her and dropped the latch, and the sound of it seemed to loosen something in her shoulders. Though her eyes stayed sharp, cataloging the room, the door, the window, the rifle now laid across the table. The way a person does when survival has taught them that safety is a location, never a certainty. He didn't move quick, didn't move gentle either. He pulled an old horse blanket down from the peg by the wall and wrapped it around her shoulders with the same plain economy he'd have used on a spooked animal, and when the wool settled against her, she closed her eyes like the weight of it both burned and soothed at once. Up close, the rope marks at her wrists told a story he didn't ask her to finish yet. He set the water pot on the stove instead and let the cabin fill with the small domestic sounds of tin and fire, because some silences needed filling with something other than questions. She stood near the heat without being told to, holding the blanket shut with one fist, and didn't sit until he set a chair near enough to the stove that refusing would have been its own kind of foolishness. When the water steamed, he handed her a mug and watched her fingers, red and shaking, clear around it without spilling a drop, a small, stubborn act of control in a night that had offered her none. It was a long while before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice had steadied some, though it stayed low. "I won't stay if you don't want me here," she said. "But don't send me back out into that." A pause and something almost like the ghost of pride surfaced under the exhaustion. "I can work. Earn my keep. Just not tonight." Ezra didn't answer that either, not with words. He reached past her to the second peg and pulled down a thicker blanket, wool-lined, and laid it on the floor near the stove before stepping back. An answer she understood better than speech. She knelt into it, slow, careful of a dress that had already torn further than it could afford to, and curled onto her side facing the fire. Before her eyes closed, she looked at him once more, measuring the way a person measures the exact size of the door they've just walked through. He dragged the chair to the far corner and sat with his back against the wall. Not sleeping, not pretending to watch her either, though some part of him did both at once. The wind kept working at the shutters. Inside, though, the cabin didn't sit as empty as it had an hour before, and Ezra found that fact harder to look at directly than the grief he'd been avoiding for 3 winters straight. But what Ezra didn't know yet, what he wouldn't learn until well past sunrise, was that she hadn't stumbled onto his cabin by luck at all. By the time the fire dropped to embers and dawn came up gray through the frosted window, Ezra woke stiff in the chair with one leg gone numb, and his back locked at an angle that made him grimace before he even opened his eyes. For half a breath, he forgot she was there, mistook the shape by the stove for a heap of blankets. Then she stirred, and the whole of the night before settled back into place around him, like a weight he hadn't asked to carry and couldn't set down. He fed the stove without a word. The sound of it woke her fully, not startled, but alert in the particular way of someone trained to come awake fast if the world shifted wrong. She sat up, holding the blanket close. The torn dress creased where the cold had frozen and thawed it against her skin overnight, and didn't ask where she was. She'd known that well enough the night before. What she seemed to be working out now was whether she was still welcome to stay. He broke a heel of cornbread into a pan of water to soften it over the stove, and it was while he worked that she finally spoke, her voice rough in the morning quiet. "I didn't steal anything," she said. "Not from your cabin, not from any wagon before it. They said if I did, made it easier to be that way." He didn't look up from the pan, didn't ask. "I know." Something in the flatness of her suitor told him she'd expected the accusation before he ever made it. Had it loaded and ready the way a man keeps a gun, loaded on a porch he doesn't trust. When the cornbread warmed through, he set the pan near her on the floor, and she ate in small, deliberate bites, testing each one before she swallowed, the way hunger behaves once it's learned not to trust abundance. He stepped out to the well while she ate, the cold sharper in daylight, the ground gone iron-hard with frost. Habit turned his eyes to the ridge before he'd even set the bucket down. No tracks, no smoke rising off any camp, no riders cutting the horizon. Whoever had held that rope hadn't followed this far. Not yet, anyway, and the yet sat in his chest the whole walk back. When he came back inside, she'd folded the wool blanket and set it against the wall, and placed the thinner horse blanket over the bench rather than leave it in a heap on the floor. Small, unnecessary tidiness that told him something about a life spent trying never to be accused of leaving a mess behind. "You got a name?" he asked, setting the bucket down. She hesitated only a breath. "Kaya." He nodded once, offering neither welcome nor rejection in the gesture, and didn't give his own name back. She didn't ask for it, which told him something, too, that she'd learned not to expect fairness returned in kind. He pointed toward the wash basin near the door instead. Water's warm if you need it. She crossed it with the same careful economy she'd shown all morning, and the torn seam at her thigh opened again with the movement, showing skin rubbed raw from cold and distance both. She didn't try to hide it. Her hand stayed steady as she washed her face and the back of her neck, and only stilled once, briefly, before she caught herself and went on. He didn't stare, didn't look away either. The questions chewing at him since the night before, how far she'd walked, whose rope that had been, whether it went stayed unspoken, asking while they were real, and real things had a way of staying once you let them in. When she'd finished, he nodded toward the chair. Sit before you fall. She said, pulling the blanket tight across the torn collar, and when he asked where she'd come from, she answered like someone bracing to walk through something with edges. West, she said. Trading post near St. David. Trappers took me from my people after a raid. Sold twice. A pause, controlled. Last man tried to trade me to men in town for whiskey. I bit the one holding the rope. They thought I'd broken. When they slept, I walked. Don't know how far. He crossed to the trunk in the corner, the one he hadn't opened since the fever, and lifted out an old wool undershirt and a pair of flannel trousers. Too short for him now, but long enough for her, and set them on the table without comment. She looked at the offering like she didn't trust it to be free of a price. You want me to work for these? No, you won't touch me for them? No, he said again, more certain the second time, and some of the coiled tension went out of her shoulders, though the wariness underneath it stayed. She dressed behind the woodpile curtain, and when she came back out, the borrowed clothes hung loose on a frame that had clearly gone without enough food for longer than one bad winter would account for. She sat where he pointed and ate more, and outside the frost held hard to the ground, and inside, the cabin no longer felt built for one man only. Whether that eased something in him or tightened it, he couldn't yet say. It was midday before she told him the thing that changed how he understood the whole of the night before. The thing that turned a stranger's desperate knock into something closer to a decision made days in advance. He'd gone out to the woodpile to split more logs before the light failed again, and she'd followed without being asked, carrying rope and nails he'd left by the door. She knelt to hold the fence post steady while he drove the hammer, and it was there, over the crack of iron on wood, that she said it plain. I didn't walk to the first light I saw, she said. I asked, before I ran. There were other women held with me, some longer than me. One of them said there was a man out past the ridge road, Army scout, gone quiet since his family died. Said he'd helped a woman run once before, didn't turn her over, didn't ask a price. Ezra's hand stilled on the hammer. The wind seemed to drop out from under him for a moment, the way it does right before a storm changes direction. That's not something I've done, he said, low. Then maybe it was someone else's story, Kaya said, and there was no apology in it, only the flat honesty of someone reporting what she'd been told, rather than what she'd verified. But it was your ridge road, your cabin. Walk toward it on a rumor, because a rumor was better than nothing, and nothing was what I had left. He didn't answer that right away. He set the hammer down and looked at her, and something in him, some old instinct for tracking a story back to its source, turned the fact over slow. Somewhere, sometime, someone had watched him do something he didn't remember doing, or had built a story out of nothing but a man living alone and keeping his door unlocked. Either way, it meant she hadn't found him by accident. It meant the men who'd held that rope might, eventually, hear the same rumor she had, and come looking in the same direction. He didn't say that part aloud, not yet. Some things needed to sit a while before man could again carry them without his hands shaking. They finished the fence in a silence that had changed shape since the morning. Not the wariness of strangers now, but something closer to two people taking the measure of a debt neither had agreed to owe. When the last post held firm, she pressed her palm flat against it, testing, and Ezra found himself watching the gesture longer than the work required. You fixed things alone a long time, she said. Long enough to forget how it goes with two hands instead of one, he answered, and the words came out plainer than he meant them, plainer than he'd said anything to another living soul in longer than he cared to count. That evening, while the dress dried near the stovepipe, he took a needle and spool of deerhide thread from the drawer and set to mending the tear at her collar, and she stood close enough to the heat to warm her hands while she watched him work the seam. You've sewn skin before? She asked, watching the needle bite through stiff, cold hide. Jackets, he said, Saddlebags, cloth where it tears, never a woman's dress. A pause, the needle steady despite it. Thread don't care who wears it, though. She studied the mended seam a long moment after he'd finished, tracing the crooked stitching with teaser, and then said the thing that had been sitting behind her eyes since the woodpile. You were Army. Scout, he said. Long enough alone you'd forgotten the sound of another voice. Unless I fought salt or kerosene, he said, and didn't mention the graves up on the ridge. And if she'd already guessed at them from the way his eyes cut that direction every morning, she didn't press the point. Some truths a person lets you arrive at in your own time. And she seemed to understand that better than most. It was that night, banking the stove before the cold deepened past midnight, that she asked him plainly whether anyone would come looking. They might, she said, if they wake sober enough to notice I'm gone. But they'd been drinking hard before I ran. Don't know what hour they'd have missed me. You see riders on your way up the ravine? No, tracks from a mule cart 2 days old. Nothing else. She looked at him steady across the low firelight. This place is far from their reach. That's why I risked the cold to find it. He wanted to believe that as much as she seemed to. But the scout in him, the part of him that had spent years reading trail sign for the Army before the fever took what mattered more, wouldn't let the matter close that easy. He'd learned a long time ago that distance only bought time. It never bought safety outright. The next 2 days passed the particular rhythm of two strangers learning the shape of a shared roof. She swept ash from the floor without being asked, and set the dishes in a pattern he hadn't taught her, but somehow matched his own habits anyway. He split enough wood to outlast a week of hard cold, and checked the 2 remaining cattle in the corral each morning, scanning the ridge out of an instinct he couldn't quiet, even when nothing moved on it. Once, crossing the well, he caught sight of Silas Varnum's Zeus smoke, rising thin and steady from the next valley over. One neighbor close enough to notice a streakish prescience. The one man who'd ridden out after the fever took Ezra's wife and daughter, bringing a sack of feed and more questions than comfort, and who Ezra had sent away with so little warmth that he hadn't come back since. Ezra watched that smoke a long moment, turning over whether distance from Silas was a mercy or a risk he hadn't properly weighed, and then went back to work without deciding. On the third evening, while he solved the raw skin at her wrists where the rope had worn deepest, his thumb caught on something in the leather still knotted loose around one cuff. A scrap she hadn't managed to work free, tooled with a mark he recognized before his mind caught up to why. A branding iron's pattern burned into the strap the same way ranchers burned it into cattle. He'd seen that exact mark before years back, scouting trail for a cavalry patrol along the Gila, tracking men who worked for a cattle and water baron whose name had followed Ezra like a burr in a saddle blanket ever since. A man called Elias Draycott, whose outfit didn't just run beef, if the old rumors held any truth at all. He didn't say the name aloud. Didn't trust his voice not to give away how much that scrap of leather had just cost him in certainty. He only set the salve aside and looked toward the window, where the last gray light was dying fast over the ridge, and where, small and dark against the snow, a single rider sat motionless on the far rise, watching the smoke from his own chimney the way a man watches something he means to come back for. Kaya followed his gaze, and her breath caught, and neither of them said a word, because some things a person understands without needing to hear it spoken first. Have you ever felt the ground under your feet shift, not from what someone told you, but from what you noticed they hadn't? What would you do if the danger closing in on someone you'd sworn to protect turned out to wear a name the whole territory still trusted? The rider on the ridge didn't move again that night. Ezra watched the spot until the dark swallowed it whole, until he couldn't tell anymore if he was seeing a man on horseback or just the shape his own nerves had built out of shadow and cold. Kaya stood a step behind him at the window, close enough that he felt the held breath in her, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, that a man who watches she at dusk and doesn't ride down is a man who already knows what he'll find there, and is only choosing his hour. By morning the ridge sat empty, snow unbroken, and Ezra told himself that was good news even while some old scouting instinct in his gut refused to agree. Supplies were near gone. Regardless, flour dusted the bottom of the sack, coffee finished 2 days back, only jerky and a scrape of beans left between them, and a man couldn't a threat on an empty larder any more than he could outwait a territory winter. He saddled the horse before first light, the animal blowing fog and stamping against a cold that had teeth in it, even through the Lianto's walls. "You said law watches this valley," Kaya said from the doorway, the Winchester resting within reach against the frame, not clutched the way it had been the first morning, but not far from her hand either. "If men come while you're gone—" "Rocks behind the ravine," he said. "Ledge above the dry creek. Nobody finds it unless they're shown, and I've shown it to exactly one living soul." He swung up into the saddle before the rest of what he felt about that fact could climb up his throat and complicate a morning that needed to stay simple. "If I'm not back by dark, I'll come back," she said, finishing it for him, though it wasn't so much as a fact she'd already dated to make true on her own terms. Not run. If they come, they'll find the door open and nothing behind it worth their trouble. He held her look a beat, longer than the moment required, then turned the horse toward the ridge road, and rode down into a day that would end up costing him more than the coin in his saddlebag. The trail into town cut through frost-scoured scrub, wagon ruts frozen hard as iron beneath a crust of old snow. Ezra kept his collar high and his hat low, and his mind busy running trail sign logic over Kaya's story from the night before. A rumor that had walked her straight to his door, a branding mark tooled into a rope strap, a rider who watched a chimney and didn't come down. Separately, each fact might have meant nothing. Strung together, they read like a trail he'd scouted before years back, and hadn't liked the end of then either. Town, when it came into view, hadn't changed since his last ride in. 3 cabins hunched against the cold, a blacksmith's shed with half its roof caved from last spring's storm, a saloon with its sign hanging crooked on one hinge. Smoke curled thin from 2 chimneys. He tied the horse at the rail outside Cole's trading post and stepped in out of the wind, and it was there, pinned crooked to the board beside the counter, that he saw the notice that changed the shape of everything he thought he understood about the night Kaya had knocked on his door. The paper was hand-lettered, ink gone thin in places from the cold, but legible enough. A description: Apache woman, 20-some years, scar at the left brow, some last seen near the closet. A reward, modest but real, and at the bottom a signature that Ezra read twice before he trusted his own eyes. E. Draycott. His chest went tight and cold in a way the winter outside hadn't managed. Property, the notice called her. 3 lines down, in language dressed up as concern for a runaway hired hand. The kind of wording a man used when he wanted the law on his side, without saying outright what he'd actually lost. Abner Cole came around the counter, wiping his hands on his apron, squinting the way he always did at anyone who hadn't been in for supplies in longer than a season. "Thought you'd hold up till spring, Holt." "Almost did." Ezra set his coin pouch on the counter, kept his voice as flat as he could make it. "Flour, beans, lard if you've got any worth the price. Coffee, salt, whatever thread you can spare." Cole raised an eyebrow at the list, weighing it the particular way small-town men weighed anything that didn't match the pattern they expected. "Feeding an army now. Winter's been hard. Takes more to see it through." The lie came out steadier than Ezra expected, though his eyes kept drifting back to the notice on the board, to that signature, to the reward figure that told him exactly how much a man's silence about a woman was worth to Elias Draycott, and exactly how little that told the whole truth. "That poster's been up a week," Cole said, following his glance, and something in his tone shifted toward caution, like he'd only just now placed why Ezra's attention had snagged there. Draycott rode through himself to post it. "Man doesn't usually trouble over a runaway hand personal like that. Sent riders out combing the flats for near a week now. You say why she ran?" Cole shrugged, the gesture of a man who'd learned a long time ago that asking Elias Draycott to explain himself wasn't a habit that kept a trading post in business. "Didn't ask, don't figure it's my business, and it ain't likely to be yours either, unless you've got a reason to make it so." The warning sat plain enough under the words that Ezra didn't need it repeated. He paid for the goods in a silence that felt heavier leaving the store than it had walking in, and while Cole weighed out the flour, a man came through the door with his boy in tow, both of them after nails and mule feed, and the man's eyes cut once toward Ezra, then again toward the sacks piling up on the counter, the particular arithmetic of small towns, where every purchase got counted and cross-referenced against what a man was known to need. Ezra didn't wait around for the sum of that arithmetic to circulate. He loaded the horse and rode out before the last light of morning burned off the frost, and it was on the road back cutting the ridgeway instead of the open flats to keep himself off any watching eye, that the true weight of the wanted and noticed settled into him proper. Draycott hadn't sent riders combing the territory over a hired hand. Men like Draycott didn't spend that kind of coin or that kind of personal attention on anything they didn't consider owned outright, land, water, or otherwise. And a man who tooled his brand into a rope strap wasn't running a ranch. He was running something closer to a trade, dressed up in cattle country respectability so thick that a trading post owner wouldn't think twice about pinning the notice to his own wall. The ride back felt longer than the ride out, every mile pressing a new question into him that he didn't have an answer for yet. How many women had walked that same rope before Kaya? How many had made it as far as a stranger's door? And how many hadn't? But what Ezra didn't expect, cresting the last rise above his own cabin, with the light already dying golden thin across the snow, was the second horse tied at his rail. He slowed his own mount to a walk, out of instinct alone, scanning the yard, the corral, the cabin's single window, before he let himself name what he was looking at. A man stood on his porch, hat in hand, in a gesture that read as neighborly right up until Ezra got close enough to see the face underneath it and recognize Elias Draycott in the flesh for the first time in the better part of 3 years. Heavier through the shoulders than Ezra remembered, better dressed than a rancher this far into hard winter had any real cause to be, and smiling in a way that didn't travel anywhere near his eyes. Holt. Draycott's voice carried easy across the yard, pitched for a friendly distance that Ezra had no intention of closing faster than necessary. Been a long while. Started to wonder if the winter hadn't finally finished what the fever started. Ezra dismounted slow, keeping the horse between himself and the porch a beat longer than courtesy required, running fast calculation on where the Winchester sat inside, and whether Kaya had made it to the rocks in time. Didn't expect company, he said, and meant it 2 ways at once. Wasn't planning to trouble you. Draycott's gaze drifted, unhurried, toward the cabin door, toward the window, toward the thin trail of smoke rising steady from the pipe. Reading it, Ezra understood with a cold drop in his stomach. The exact same way Ezra himself had read another man's chimney smoke a week back scouting patrol lines. Just ride the flats, checking on outfits I've got interest in nearby. Heard you'd taken on help. Man living alone this many winters, hard to manage a spread without a second set of hands. The words landed soft, almost kind, and that was precisely what made them dangerous. Ezra kept his own face as flat as frozen ground. Manage fine enough alone. Course you do. Draycott's smile didn't move, though something calculating shifted behind his eyes, cataloging the lie the same unhurried way he'd cataloged the smoke. Man hears things riding these parts, though. Rumors travel faster than good sense out here. Heard talk of a woman matching a certain description, moving this direction some nights back. Be a shame if a decent man like yourself got tangled up sheltering something that ain't rightfully his to shelter. Don't know what you're referring to, Ezra said, and every word of it cost him something to keep level. Draycott studied him a long moment, the kind of look a man gives a fence line he's deciding whether to test the give of, and then set his hat back on his head with a motion almost lazy in its confidence. No trouble in that. Man's entitled to his privacy. He gathered his reins, swung up into the saddle with the ease of someone who'd never once doubted his own welcome anywhere in the territory. I'll be riding back this way inside the week, though. Business I've got pending nearby. If you happen to hear anything, see anything worth a reward, my offer stands generous. Wouldn't want a good neighbor caught holding something that brings trouble down on land he's worked hard for. The threat sat under the words plain as a brand under hide, and Draycott let it sit there a beat before turning his horses and riding off, unhurried down the ridge road, like a man who had all the time in the world and knew it. Ezra didn't move until the hoofbeats faded past the tree line. Then he crossed the yard, fast, calling close toward the rocks behind the ravine, and it took 3 long minutes that stretched out longer than the whole of Draycott's visit combined, before Kaya emerged from the dry creek bed, moving low and silent between the boulders with a control that told him plain she hadn't been hiding out of fear alone. She'd been reading the land the whole time she crouched there, marking the horse's gait, the direction it came from, the length of the visit, the exact moment it was safe to move. You heard him, Ezra said. Not a question. Enough of it. Her jaw was tight, but her hands, he noticed, weren't shaking, steadier now, if anything, than they'd been that first night on his porch. That was Draycott. You know the name. I know the brand, she said, and touched the scrap of rope leather that still knotted at her wrist. Didn't have the face to put to it till now. He came through the trading post twice while I was held. Never touched the stock himself, left that to the men who worked for him, but he set the prices. She looked toward the ridge road, toward where the dust of Draycott's departure still hung faint in the cold air. That poster in town, what's it say I did? Says you're a runaway hand? And watch some see her face go still and hard at the wording. The particular insult of Lali that dressed up a woman as property and called it a favor to the reader. Rewards modest, enough to buy silence from most folks who wouldn't look twice past it. He won't stop at silence, Kaya said, low, certain. Man like that doesn't chase a runaway hand personal with his own horse and his own voice. He's protecting something bigger than one woman gone missing. It was a thought that had already been circling Ezra's own mind the whole ride home, and hearing her land on it independent of him only sharpened the unease sitting in his chest. He looked past her toward the ridge where Draycott's ranch lay somewhere out past the flats. Further still toward the low water line that cut the whole valley. A line he'd never thought much about until this moment when it struck him who was on troll that is dead, and every he had cattle downstream included. If he could just clear the people off it quiet enough that nobody in town asked why. That evening, banking the stove against a cold that had sharpened since Draycott's visit, Ezra found the second thing that would keep him from sleeping that night, and it came from a place he hadn't thought to suspect until the fact was staring him plain in the face. Sorting through the saddlebag he'd carried it into town, checking the coin against what he'd spent, he found a folded scrap of paper tucked where he hadn't put it. A note, unsigned, in handwriting he recognized immediately because he'd seen it before years back on a feed receipt left at his door the week after his wife and daughter went into the ground. Silas Varnum's hand. 3 lines, no greeting, no name attached. Man asking after the woman. Offered Faircon for word of any stranger seen this way. Told him nothing yet, but he'll come around himself soon enough. Thought you should know before he does. Ezra read it twice, and the second read didn't sit any easier than the first. The note read like a warning. On its surface, a neighbor doing a decent turn, passing along danger before it arrived unannounced. But the wording caught at him wrong the longer he turned it over. Told him nothing yet. Not told him nothing. A distinction so small a careless reader might have missed it entirely. And Ezra had got too many trails in his life to be a careless reader of anything. He rode to Varnum's place at first light the next morning, leaving Kaya with the rifle and the same instructions as before, and found Silas out at his own woodpile, breath fogging thick and air gone bitter, with a fresh front moving down from the north. Silas straightened at the sight of him, something flickering behind his eyes too fast to name before it smoothed back into the same neighborly ease Ezra remembered from 3 years back. The same ease that had ridden out after the feeder, offering feed and questions Ezra hadn't wanted to answer. Holt, didn't expect you riding this way. Silas set the axe down, wiped his palms on his trousers. Heard you'd taken up quiet again, out at the cabin. Figured you for the type to stay that way. Got your note, Ezra said, watching him close. Draycott, come around here too then. Something shifted, brief, in the set of Silas's shoulders. Rode through 3 days back, asking after strangers on the ridge road. Offered coin for word of anyone seen passing. A pause, careful. I didn't give him anything, Ezra. Told him I hadn't seen a soul all winter. Note says you told him nothing yet, Ezra said, and let the words sit there between them. Watching Silas's face for whatever truth might surface under the pressure of it. Into the silence that followed ran longer than a man with nothing to hide would have let it run. Finally, Silas exhaled, rough, and rubbed a hand across his jaw. Man's got money in half this territory, Ezra. Water rights, cattle contracts, a say in who gets credit at coal store and who doesn't. I've got 4 seasons of bad crop behind me, and a debt to his outfit I can't see clear of before next fall. His voice dropped, not proud of what came next, but saying it anyway. He asked me to watch the ridge road. Said there'd be coin in it if I saw anything worth reporting. I told myself I'd only pass along what didn't matter. Told myself that note to you squared it. You've been feeding him what he needs to find her? Ezra said, flat, and felt something in his chest go cold and final, in a way that had nothing left of neighborly patience in it. I haven't told him where, Silas said quickly, hands up, placating. Swear it, Ezra, I've stalled him best I can. But he's not a patient man, and he's not asking anymore. Yesterday he stopped asking and started telling. Said he'd be back through in 3 days' time with papers, a deed, a debt claim, something drawn up legal enough to hold in front of a circuit judge if he ever bothers bringing one out this far. Said if I didn't have something useful to give him by then, my own note wouldn't be worth the debt he's holding over me. The old ridge wind picked up hard between them, carrying the particular chill of a threat with a deadline attached, and Ezra understood in that moment that whatever mercy or hesitation Draycott had shown at the cabin porch the day before had already run its course. 3 days. A forged claim dressed up as legal paper aimed not just at Kaya now but likely at the land under Ezra's own boots. Land a man like Draycott could just as easily decide belonged to him if nobody stood in the way of the deed changing hands on paper alone. You'll tell him nothing, Ezra said, and it wasn't a request. I know that now, Silas said, and something in his voice cracked with the particular shame of a man who'd let debt talk into betrayal before his own conscience caught up to stop him. I should have told you the day he first asked. I'm sorry, Ezra. Truly, whatever's coming, I'll stand where I should have stood from the start. Ezra studied him a long moment, weighing the apology against the note still folded in his coat pocket, and found he couldn't yet decide whether Silas Varnum was a man or a man cornered by consequence into sounding like one. Trust, once cracked, didn't mend on the strength of an apology alone. But 3 days wasn't enough time to sort the difference, and a man low on allies couldn't afford to burn one down to the ground over uncertainty he hadn't the leisure to resolve. 3 days, Ezra said, turning his horse back toward the ridge road. You want to stand right, Silas. You'll ride word to me the moment he moves, not after. He rode back to the cabin, with the cold settling deeper into him than the weather alone accounted for, and told Kaya everything. The story on the threatened porch, Silas's note, and the debt behind it, the 3-day deadline hanging over both of them now like a blade set to drop. She took it in without flinching, the way she seemed to take in every hard fact life put in front of her, and when he finished she was quiet a long moment, staring to the stove's low flame. He won't come with 2 men next time, she said finally. A man who controls water and credit for half a territory doesn't need to threaten twice before he brings enough guns to make the threat unnecessary. No, Ezra agreed. He won't. We don't wait for him to choose the ground, she said. And there was something new in her voice now, steadier than fear, closer to resolve hardened to which we are too many years of having grown for her by other people. 3 days is enough time to choose our own. Outside, the wind kept working at the ravine walls, indifferent to deadlines or deeds or debts, and inside, Ezra Holt sat across from a woman who had walked out of one kind of captivity, only to find herself standing at the edge of a fight that had apparently been building around his own land, long before she ever knocked on his door, and found, turning the whole of it over in his mind, that some part of him had already stopped asking whether this was his fight to take on, and some start asking instead how a man went about winning it. It makes you wonder how much of the danger closing in on us was already circling, long before we ever noticed the first knock at the door. Sometimes the fight that saves you isn't the one you throw the first punch in. It's the one you refuse to walk away from. 3 days. Ezra Holt had scouted enough hostile country in his years with the army to know that a deadline handed to you by an enemy was never really about the deadline at all. It was about making you spend those days afraid instead of ready. He decided, riding back from Silas Varnum's place, with the wind cutting harder across the flats than it had all week, that he wasn't going to hand Elias Draycott that kind of victory before a single shot got fired. Kaya was waiting at the door when he rode in, rifle within reach but not clutched, the same steady posture she'd carried since the morning she stopped flinching at his footsteps. She read the set of his jaw before he'd even dismounted. You've got a plan, she said, not a question. Start of one. He swung down, looped the reins over the rail. A man like Draycott wins by making people face him alone. Scared, quiet, ashamed of needing help, he looked toward the ridge road, toward the low country beyond it, where 3 seasons of bad crops and worse debt had quietly strangled half the homesteads in the valley. We don't let this stay between the two of us. Kaya's brow drew tight. You mean to bring others into it? I mean to ride out tomorrow and find out how many men in this valley have a reason to hate Elias Draycott as much as we do, Ezra said. I'd wager it's more than either of us has counted yet. He was right, though it took the better part of the next day to prove it. And every mile of that ride peeled back another layer of a truth Ezra realized he'd been living beside for years, without ever adding it up. The Larkin place, 2 homesteads west, sat half-fenced and short 2 hands, because Draycott's outfit had bought up their note the winter before last, and squeezed the interest tighter every season since. Old man Whitfield, who ran what cattle he had left along the dry wash, had lost water access 2 summers back, when Draycott's men diverted the upper creek onto Draycott land and called it a survey correction. Nobody in town had the coin or the courage to contest. A Mexican family named Reyes, working a small spread near the crossing, had buried a cousin the autumn before, found dead along the very stretch of trail where the wanted notices for runaway Apache women always seemed to originate, though nobody had ever proven a connection out loud. By the time Ezra rode back toward his own cabin under a sky gone the color of gunmetal, he understood that Kaya's captivity wasn't an isolated cruelty. It was a thread in a larger pattern. Land taken, water diverted, debts weaponized, people made to disappear or made too afraid to speak when they didn't. Draycott hadn't built an empire on cattle alone. He built it on making sure nobody in the valley trusted anybody else enough to compare notes. That realization sat heavy in Ezra's chest that night, heavier than the cold, and it was Kaya who put words to what he was still circling. "You're not just protecting me anymore," she said, watching him from across the low firelight. "You've started seeing the whole shape of it. Man spends years scouting trail," Ezra said slow, "learns to hate not seeing the whole shape of a thing. Costs lives, not seeing it whole. And now that you see it?" He didn't answer right away. Outside, the wind had dropped to something almost gentle, the calm that sometimes settled a valley in the hours before a real storm arrived. "Now I ride out again tomorrow," he said finally, "and I ask men who've been too scared to speak alone whether they're willing to stand together instead." It was harder than he expected, and easier than he feared, in roughly equal measure. Whitfield, gray-bearded, and stooped from a lifetime of hard winters, listened to Ezra's account of the wanted notice, the sporch visit, Silas's note, and set his coffee cup down, with a hand that trembled slightly from age rather than fear. "Been waiting 3 years for a man fool enough, or brave enough to say Draycott's name out loud where it might carry consequence," he said. "Count me in, Holt. I've got little enough left to lose that losing it standing up beats losing it lying down." The Reyes family took longer to convince, and Ezra didn't press past their first refusal. Grief over the cousin buried the autumn before sat too close to the surface, and pushing a grieving man toward a fight he wasn't ready for wasn't leadership. It was just another kind of taking. But it was the eldest Reyes son, quiet through the whole conversation, who caught up to Ezra's horse at the property line as he rode out. "My father says no," the young man said, "because Has's afraid of losing what's left of us. I say yes, because I'm afraid of what happens if nobody ever says it." He looked back once toward the house, then squared his shoulders. "I'll ride with you, Holt. Not for you. For Marisol." Ezra didn't ask who Marisol was. Some names a man only shared once he trusted the weight would be carried right. And the look on the young man's face told Ezra everything he needed to know about how carefully that weight ought to be handled. By the second night, he'd gathered 5 men beyond himself. Whitfield, the Reyes son whose name turned out to be Tomas, 2 brothers named Odell who ran a hardscrabble spread near the flats, and had their own account to settle over a water diversion that had cost them half a herd, and a former cavalry corporal named Briggs who mustered out 3 years back, and take up trapping in the high country, a man still kept his old servant rifle oiled and ready out of habit more than expectation. None of them were soldiers by trade anymore. All of them had reasons sharp enough to make up the difference. They gathered at Ezra's cabin on the evening of the second day, the small room crowded tighter than it had been, and longer than Ezra could remember, and as Wakia, who spread a rough map across the table, drawn from memory and confirmed against the terrain she'd studied, hiding in the rocks above the dry creek. "Draycott's men will come up the ridge road," she said, tracing the line with a steady finger, "because it's the only approach wide enough for horses moving fast and men that confident don't expect to need another way in." Her fingers shifted the narrow cut where the ravine pinched tight above the cabin. "But there's a place here, a bottleneck. Anyone coming through has to slow to single file, and anyone holding the high rock on either side controls what happens next." Briggs leaned over the midst of its joined the terrain with the flat professional focus of an old soldier. "You scouted this yourself?" 3 days hiding in it, Kaya said, and there was no self-pity in the words, only the plain fact of survival turned now into something useful. I know every stone a man could catch his boot on in the dark. Whitfield let out a low whistle, something between admiration and disbelief. Well, I'll be damned. Holt, you didn't tell us your household came equipped with its own scout. Ezra caught Kaya's eye across the table, and something passed between them that wasn't quite a smile, but sat close enough to one, and he found himself saying, with more conviction than he'd expected the words to carry, "She's not equipped with anything. She's the reason we've got a plan worth trusting instead of Siddiq's men riding blind into open ground." The room went quiet a beat at that, not discomfort, but the particular silence of men recalibrating who exactly they were following into a fight. And then Tomas Reyes nodded once, firm, and the moment passed into planning instead of doubt. They spent that night and the better part of the following day preparing the ground, and it was grinding, unglamorous work. Packing loose scree along the rim of the bottleneck to loosen a rope's pull. Stringing snare, wire, low, where a horse would stumble, but a man on foot could step clear. Positioning Briggs and one of the Odell brothers on the high rock with rifles and a clear line down into the cut. Placing Whitfield and Tomas further back along the ridge road itself to close the retreat. Once riders committed to the narrow ground. Akaya moved through all of it with an authority that surprised every man there except Ezra. Correcting angles, testing sight lines, adjusting the placement of a fallen log full feet because, as she put it flatly to a skeptical Odell brother, a man diving for cover behind that log at that angle exposes his back to the rock instead of protecting it, and I'd rather you alive to argue with me again tomorrow. Ezra watched her direct 6 grown men twice her size through the fine mechanics of an ambush he'd built entirely from memory and instinct, and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have easy words for. Not gratitude exactly, though there was plenty of that, but something closer to the particular respect a man feels watching someone prove, without asking permission, that they were an animal who needed solid saving in the way he'd first assumed. But the third climax of that stretch of days didn't come from the ridge, or the rocks, or any part of the plan Kaya had drawn across Ezra's table. It came riding hard up the road at dusk on the evening before Draycott's deadline, in the shape of Silas Varnum, horse-lathered whites with sweat, shouting Ezra's name before he'd even cleared the tree line. Ezra met him in the yard, hand instinctively near the Winchester, slung across his shoulder until he read the look on Silas and understood the danger wasn't riding behind him. "He's moved the date up," Silas said, breathless, swinging down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. "Rode through my place an hour back. Said he'd got word. Someone in town, maybe Cole, maybe one of the men who saw you loading double supplies. Said he'd got word you weren't alone at that cabin no more, and men gathering with you besides. Said waiting 3 days was a courtesy he wasn't inclined to extend to a man building himself an army." "When?" Ezra said, flat, already calculating what daylight remained. "Tonight." Silas's chest heaved, and there was something in his face that hadn't been there at the woodpile 3 days before. Not the guilt of a cornered debtor this time, but something harder, more decided. "He's riding with 6 men, maybe 8. Said if the woman wasn't handed over by moonrise, he'd take the cabin and the land both and settle the paperwork after, when there was nobody left with cause to argue it in front of a judge." The words landed in the yard like a dropped weight, and for one long breath nobody moved. Then Ezra felt something in himself go still, and clear the way it used to go still and clear scouting hostile trail for the army. The particular coffin that came not from the absence of fear, but from finally, fully understanding the shape of the danger in front of him. "You rode here to warn us," Ezra said, watching Silas's face, "knowing what that costs you with him." "I rode here," Silas said, voice rough, "because 3 days back you asked me which side I meant to stand on, and I've spent every hour since deciding I'd rather lose everything Draycott could take from me than lose the chance to stand where I should have stood from the start." He reached into his coat, hand shaking slightly, and drew out a folded packet of papers, worn soft at the creases like they'd been carried and reread many times over. "And because I didn't just come to warn you, I came to give you this." Ezra took the packet and unfolded it there in the failing light, and it took him a moment to understand exactly what he was looking at. Ledger pages copied in a careful hand, recording payments made to men whose names Ezra recognized from the Trading Post notice board over the years. each entry logged against a woman's description instead of a name, each payment routed through an account bearing Elias Draycott's signature. Beneath the ledger pages sat a second document, a land survey dated 18 months back, showing the water diversion off Whitfield's dry wash rerouted onto Draycott Holdings under a filing that predated the actual survey work by a full season. Proof, in ink and official seal, that the correction had been fraud from its very first line. "Where did you get this?" Ezra said, low, disbelieving.
"I've been his bookkeeper's neighbor 11 years, Silas said.
"Man drinks too much and talks too loose when he does. I've been copying what I could get my hands on for the better part of a year now. Telling myself I was keeping it for insurance, never for use. Didn't have the nerve to use it till tonight." He looked at Ezra, something raw and finally unguarded in his face. "There's a federal marshal riding circuit through the territory this month, stationed temporary out of Prescott on account of the land disputes stacking up along the water rights I sent. And word 2 days back, the same day I sent you that note. Told myself if I was covering my own risk either way it landed. Truth is I was scared to choose, and choosing scared me more than Draycott ever did." Ezra studied the ledger pages a long moment, the weight of them settling into something larger than personal vengeance now. Proof, if enough, held up in front of the right authority, to end Elias Draycott's reach over the whole valley rather than simply drive him off one cabin's porch for a season. "Where's this marshal now?" 2 days out, maybe less if he's pushed hard, Silas said. "I sent the boy from the Vrace place riding for him myself, soon as I heard Draycott move the date up. If he rides through Threnna, he won't make it as doing the math against the dying light. Which means whatever happens at that bottleneck happens without him." Kaya, who had come out onto the porch, mummer in the middle of Silas's account, still forward now, studying the ledger pages over Ezra's shoulder with an intensity that told him she was already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. "Then we don't need to win the fight tonight," she said. "We only need to survive it long enough for that marshal to arrive with the proof strong enough to hold Draycott past whatever violence happens on this ridge. Survive an armed man with 6 riders and a grudge," Odell's brother said from the doorway, skeptical, "on the strength of paperwork 2 days out. On the strength of a bottleneck we built to favor 6 men over 8. Kaya corrected, steady, and on the strength of proof that turns this from a range war nobody outside the valley will ever hear about into a federal matter a marshal has to answer for whether he wants to or not." She looked to Ezra. "Draycott's whole power rests on nobody outside this valley knowing what he's built here. That ledger changes that. He knows it, too, the moment he learns it exists." Ezra turned that over, feeling the shape of a new plan click into place alongside the old one, and looked to Silas. "You'll testify to where you got this. In front of the marshal, in front of a judge, if it comes to that." "I will," Silas said, and there was no hesitation in it this time, whatever it costs. They spent the last hour of daylight reworking the plan around the ledger's existence, and it was full dark by the time every man was positioned. Briggs and one Odell brother high on the rock, with rifles and a clear line into the cut. Kaya positioned with Ezra, near the loosened scree at the bottleneck's mouth. Whitfield and Tomas holding the ridge road behind to close the retreat. Silas riding hard back toward the trading post to intercept the marshal the moment he crossed into the valley and bring him straight to the ravine, proof in hand. The waiting, Ezra had learned long ago scouting for the army, was always worse than the fight itself. Cold settled deep into the rock around them, and the moon loomed slow behind thin cloud. And somewhere past midnight the first sound came. Not hoofbeats yet, but the low murmur of men who didn't think anyone was near enough to hear them talking. Kaya's hand found Ezra's arm in the dark, a brief, steadying pressure. 8 riders, she breathed, barely audible. Maybe 9. He came heavier than Silas said. Then we hold heavier than he expects. Ezra murmured back, and felt her nod once against the dark beside him. The riders came up the ridge road at a pace that spoke of confidence bordering on carelessness. Draycott hadn't expected resistance built with this much care, and Ezra watched from the rock shadow as the column funneled, exactly as Kaya had predicted, into the narrow cut where the terrain forced them single file. He counted the shapes as they passed below. 8 riders, Draycott himself near the front on a tall gray horse, unmistakable even in poor light by the particular easy arrogance of his posture. The ambush, when it came fast and controlled, nothing like the chaos Ezra had half feared in the sleepless hours before. Briggs's rope pulled the loosened scree at the signal, sending a controlled slide of rock and gravel down across the trail's midpoint, spooking the lead horses into a tangle that stalled the whole column dead in the bottleneck's narrowest point. In the same breath, Whitfield and Tomas closed the road behind, blocking retreat, and Briggs's voice rang out from the high rock, flat and carrying in the cold night air. Hold where you stand. You're covered from both sides. And there's more proof against you riding this valley tonight than you've got riders to silence. For a long taut moment, nothing moved. Then Draycott's voice came up out of the confusion below, controlled despite the trap closing around him, the same easy assurance Ezra remembered from the porch a week before. Holt, I underestimated you. Didn't figure a grief-sick rancher for tactics. Wasn't my tactics, Ezra called back, steady. Wasn't my land either, if we're speaking plain tonight. Belongs to every family you've squeezed dry these 3 years, and every woman you've priced like cattle stock. A ripple moved through the riders below at that. Not all of Draycott's men, Ezra understood watching them, had known the full shape of what they were riding for tonight, and hearing it, said plain into the dark, did something to the confidence of at least 2 or 3 shapes he could see shifting uneasy in their saddles. Careful. Holt, Draycott called, though something in his voice had thinned, the arrogance working harder now to cover ground it hadn't needed to cover before. Accusations don't hold weight without proof, and I don't see any judge riding with you tonight. It was Kais's voice that answered him, clear and unshaking from the rock shadow beside Ezra. And Ezra felt something fierce and proud rise in his chest hearing her claim the moment for herself, rather than let it pass through him alone. The proof's already riding toward this valley, she called down. Ledger pages in your own bookkeeper's hand, and a federal marshal to read them. You can settle this tonight with more blood, Draycott. Or you can settle it standing in front of a judge who'll want to know exactly why a cattleman's been buying women like beef stock for 3 years running. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Ezra counted his own heartbeat twice through it, and it was in that silence that the true climax of the standoff turned. Not on a shot fired, but on the sound of one rider near the rear of Draycott's walking for a fair mission, walking his horse slow and deliberate to the side of the trail, hands raised clear of his reins. I didn't sign on for this, the man called, voice cracking with something between fear and disgust. Told you I'd ride for wages, not for not knowing this. I'm out, Draycott. Whatever's coming, I'll take my chances answering for it honest. A second rider pulled in, the Plead away from the column in the flickering half-light, and Ezra watched Elias Draycott's carefully built authority come apart, not from the guns trained on him from the rocks, but from the simple, corrosive fact of his own men refusing, one by one, to keep for a lie once it had been spoken plain into the open air. It was, Ezra thought, watching it happen, the truest lesson the whole ordeal had to offer, that a man's power built on silence could survive almost anything except the moment somebody finally said the truth out loud where everyone could hear it. Draycott's voice, when it came again, had lost the last of its easy confidence, gone tight and cornered instead. You think a ledger and a marshal changes what's mine by contract, Holt. I'll have lawyers in this valley faster than any circuit judge can. Won't need to wait for lawyers. A new voice cut in, deep and unhurried, riding up the ridge road from behind Whitfield's position, and every head on the trail turned as a rider in a long duster came into the torchlight, badge catching the low fire glow, Silas Varnum close behind him on a horse blown hard from riding through the night. Federal Marshal Coleman Reyes out of Prescott. The marshal's eyes swept the trap column. The ledger pages already extended toward him from Silas's shaking hand, and settled last and longest on Elias Draycott, still mounted, still cornered, all his easy arrogance finally nowhere in sight. Mr. Draycott, I've got testimony and documentation enough here who told you on federal land human trafficking charges both, and I'd wager a night in a cell will do wonders for jogging loose whatever else your bookkeeper's been too scared to volunteer on his own account. Draycott's jaw worked once, twice, some final calculation running behind his eyes. The arithmetic, Ezra understood watching him, of a man who had built his entire life on being the one who held every card, finally counting out how few remained in his hand. Whatever he saw in that count, it wasn't enough to fight. His shoulders dropped, and the worker stood still beneath him, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone flat and small in a way it had never once sounded on Ezra's porch a week before. This isn't finished, Holt. No, Ezra agreed, lowering the rifle he hadn't realized he'd raised. But it's finished for you. The marshal took Draycott into custody. There on the Ridge Road, the remaining fighters disarmed and questioned one by one in the cold hour before dawn. Most of them, it turned out, more relieved than resistant at the prospect of walking away from an outfit that had never told them the full truth of what they'd been hired to protect. Two of Draycott's men, pressed hard by the marshal's questions, gave up names and locations that would, over the weeks that followed, unravel the trading network Kaya had saved and led to the recovery of 3 more women held along routes further south. A fact that reached Ezra only later, secondhand, but that settled in him with a weight heavier than anything else that long night produced. Dawn came up gray and quiet over the ravine, the fight already receding into the strange, hollow calm that follows violence narrowly avoided, rather than fully unleashed. Ezra found Kaya standing apart from the others, near the mouth of the bottleneck she'd designed, watching the marshal's party lead Draycott away down the ridge road under a sky just beginning to pale toward morning. "You did that," Ezra said, coming to stand beside her. "All of it. The ground, the plan, the words that finally cracked his own men loose from him." She didn't answer right away, her eyes still tracking the departing column until it dropped from sight behind the far rise. "I spent 3 years being told what I was worth by men who never once asked me," she said, finally, voice quiet but steady. "Tonight, I decided what I was worth instead, and said it loud enough that other people had to listen." She turned to look at him then, something unguarded in her face that hadn't been there even in the gentlest of their evenings by the stove. "I didn't do it for you, Ezra. I want you to understand that. I did it because I was done being someone else's decision. I understand that," Ezra said, and meant it fully, feeling something in his chest settle into a shape he hadn't expected grief and cold and 3 lonely winters to ever make room for again. "Doesn't mean I'm not grateful you decided to make your stand on this particular piece of ground." Something close to a smile moved across her face then, brief but real. "This particular piece of ground has decent water," she said, "and a man willing to hand a stranger a blanket before he ever asked her name. It wasn't the worst ground to choose." They rode back to the cabin together as the sun cleared the ridge proper, and it was 3 days later, once the marshal's business in the valley had concluded, and the last of the paperwork settling Whitfield's water rights, and the Reyes family's rightful claims had been filed at the territorial land office. Ezra found himself climbing the low rise behind his cabin for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit was true. Kaya walking a half step behind him, neither hurrying nor lagging, simply present. The 2 markers under the cottonwoods sat half buried in the last of the season's snow, and Ezra knelt to clear it away with his bare hands, cold biting sharp against his palms, uncovering first his wife's name carved plain into the wood, then, smaller, beside it, his daughter's. He rested his hand flat against the larger marker a long moment, and for the first time since the fever took them, the weight in his chest didn't feel like something crushing him slowly from the inside. It felt instead like grief finally given room to breathe alongside something else. Not replacing it, never that, but standing beside it the way Kaya now stood beside him, quiet, not intruding, only present enough to matter. "I used to think coming up here was the only honest thing left in my life," Ezra said, not turning. "Rest of it felt like performance. Feeding cattle I didn't care whether I kept. Mending fences nobody but me would ever see." He brushed the last of the snow from the smaller marker, his daughter's name catching the pale morning light. "Up here was the only place I let myself feel the whole weight of it without pretending otherwise." "And now?" Kaya asked, her voice careful, giving him room to answer or not as he chose. "Now I think I've been carrying the weight alone longer than I needed to," he said, and turned to look at her fully for the first time since they'd climbed the rise. "You asked me once whether I'd want you here when spring came. Never got the chance to answer proper. With everything that came after." He held her gaze, steady, the same steadiness she'd shown him standing in his doorway that first frozen night. "I want that, not because you're owed shelter for what you survived. Because this ground's better with 2 sets of hands working it than one, same as you told me yourself, mending fence, longer ago than it feels." Kaya knelt beside him then and swept the last of the snow from the base of both markers with her own hands. An act of quiet tending that Ezra understood, without needing it explained, as her answer arriving before her words did. When she straightened, her eyes were steady on his. "Can I stay?" she said, Not for the cold I walked in from, for the ground I've chosen to stand on now that I finally get to choose. They walked back down the rise together as the morning widened around them, the valley below stretching out toward a horizon no longer haunted, at least for now, by the shadow of a man who had made a business out of other people's silence. Behind them, the two markers stood clear of snow for the first time in months. No longer a wound Ezra rubbed raw every winter morning, but a resting place he could finally visit without the visit, costing him everything else he had left to give. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much of what wears us down in life isn't the hardship itself, but the belief that we have to carry it alone. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive all at once. The buzz, loud and unmistakable from the first gust. It's slow, the way frost creeps into a window pane overnight, and by the time you notice it's there, it's already claimed more ground than you realized you'd given up. Ezra Holt spent three winters believing that loneliness was simply the honest cost of loving people he'd lost. He wasn't wrong that grief deserved honoring. Where he'd gone wrong, without ever quite meaning to, was in believing that honoring grief required shutting every other door in his life along with it. Believing that letting someone else in, even a stranger half frozen on his porch, was somehow a betrayal of the family he'd buried on that ridge. What his story asks us to sit with gently is whether that belief is one a lot of us carry longer than we need to. Whether we've mistaken isolation for loyalty, silence for strength, the closed door for the safest one. The truth this story circles back to, again and again, is that opening the door didn't cost Ezra his grief. It gave that grief somewhere honest to live, instead of a locked room he visited alone every winter morning out of habit, rather than healing. And there's a second thread worth pulling gently at, too. The thread that runs through Kaya's arc from the very first knock on that door. She didn't arrive in this story to execute, though rescue was certainly part of what that first night offered her. She arrived and stayed, and ultimately turned the tide of the entire conflict because somewhere along the way, she stopped letting other people decide what she was worth. That's a harder lesson than it sounds, and a slower one, too. It doesn't happen in a single dramatic moment, however satisfying that ambush on the ridge road might have felt to witness. It happens in small increments, in choosing to fold a blanket neatly instead of leaving it in a heap, in asking for a name and offering one back, in learning, meal by meal and day by day. That safety could be a place you built for yourself, rather than a mercy someone else extended to you. By the time she stood at that bottleneck directing 6 armed men through terrain she'd mapped from memory, she wasn't the same frightened woman who'd begged at a stranger's door. She was someone who had quietly, patiently, reclaimed her own authority over her own life, one decision at a time. And then there's Silas Varnum, who offers maybe the most uncomfortable lesson of the three, precisely because so many of us recognize some piece of ourselves in him. He wasn't a villain. He was a frightened man in debt, yet doing the small, quiet math that frightened people in debt so often do. Telling himself that passing along just enough information to survive wasn't the same as betrayal, that there was a difference between actively harming someone and simply failing to actively help them. It's an easy math to do. Most of us have done some version of it ourselves, in smaller rooms over smaller stakes. What matters in the end isn't that Silas nearly crossed that line. What matters is that when the moment finally arrived, the real moment, not the comfortable hypothetical one, he chose to ride through the night with proof in his coat pocket instead of staying home where it was safer to stay quiet. Redemption in this story doesn't erase what he almost did. It simply proves that a person gets to choose, right up until the very last possible moment which side of a line they're going to stand on. There's also something worth noticing in how the danger in this story was defeated. Not through Ezra Holt riding out alone with a rifle and a grudge, however satisfying that image might be in the abstract, but through a valley full of separately wounded people finally comparing notes. Whitfield's water, the Reyes family's grief, the Odell brothers' cattle, Kaya captivity. None of those harms alone might have been enough to move a marshal or crack Draycott's confidence, or turn his own men against him in the middle of a cold ridge road at midnight. It was the pattern, once it was finally spoken aloud, that did the real work. That's a quiet but persistent truth about the way real injustice so often survives. Not because any single person lacks the courage to fight it, but because isolation keeps every wounded party believing their hardship is theirs alone to carry, unconnected to the family two homesteads over enduring something disturbingly similar. The moment those separate silences became one shared, spoken truth, the whole structure resting on top of that silence came apart in a single night. None of this is to say the story hands us easy answers, and it shouldn't. Ezra still carries his grief up that ridge every season, and he always will. Kaya's scars, the ones on her wrists and the ones nobody can see, didn't vanish the moment Dracot was led away in irons. Silas will spend a long while rebuilding trust that his own fears spent cheaply. Healing, this story suggests, was never about erasing what happened. It was about refusing to let what happened be the only thing that ever happens again. So, perhaps the question worth carrying with you long after this particular winter on this particular ridge has faded from memory is a simple one, though not always an easy one to answer honestly. Where in your own life have you mistaken silence for safety? Where have you told yourself that carrying something alone was nobler, or safer, or simply easier than asking for the help sitting closer than you realized? And where, if you're honest with yourself, might opening a door you've kept shut for a long while cost you far less than you've spent years assuming it would? Have you ever had to between staying silent to protect yourself and speaking up even though it cost you something? Tell us in the comments. Your story might be exactly the thing someone else reading this needs to hear tonight.